Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's ContainerJournal.com panel, brought to you by Techstrong. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we've got an exciting panel ahead. First, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. First off, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session. If you have any questions, we want you to go ahead and send those in using the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of the screen. And that's also where you're going to find the chat tab. And that's where we want you to engage with us, engage with one another. Just let us know your thoughts throughout today's program. And finally, before we close, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around until the very end. So our topic today is container and Kubernetes management. And I am joined by a swath of expert panelists. I will turn the floor over to Mike Vizard, who will lead our discussion today, and he will also allow them to introduce themselves. Mike, take it away.
Thanks, Cody. I'm Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer for Techstrong, and we do have this massive amount of knowledge all in one place at one time. It doesn't always happen this way, so we're kind of excited about this. First, though, I want to introduce our speakers, so I'm going to start with Roxana Chibano, who is going to introduce herself, tell you a little bit about her title and her company, and then we're going to go around the horn and go the same way with everybody else. So that way you all have some perspective on the answers they're providing to the questions. Roxana?
Hello, my name is Roxana Chibano, and I'm the CTO of Banishal, an environment as a service platform that focuses on increasing performance and release frequency in engineering teams. My background is in development, DevOps, and cloud architecture.
All right, great. Thanks for being here. Nung.
Hey, all you cool cats and kittens out in Kubernetes land. I'm Nung Bedell, and I'm a customer reliability engineer at Fairwinds. And Fairwinds is the trusted partner for Kubernetes security, policy, and governance.
Did you guys?
We also have a lot. And we also have a lot of open source projects that we maintain and share with the community on managing Kubernetes.
All right, I just want to check. Are you going to copyright "the" in front of that? So the highest thing, the whole thing is done.
Right. I think we can say anything we want, right? And someone goes wrong.
All right, Josh.
Hey,
welcome.
Thanks. Happy to be here. I'm Josh Hoagie, joining you from Brooklyn, New York, and I come from a security and on-net cyber background, currently at Strong DM, the people first infrastructure access platform. I get to see a lot of customers either along their Kubernetes journey and help them problem solve and address things and think about the stuff that maybe you didn't think about when you were planning it. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Jared, want to introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Jared Curtis. I'm the cloud architect at Xpaners and Everbridge Company, and I am the source of all the bad ideas and occasionally a good one.
All right. Good thing you take the accountability to yourself. That's an awesome thing right there. Jacob, welcome.
Hey, happy to be here. My name is Jacob Graves. I'm a solutions engineer at Orca Security. We do agentless cloud security, but that includes Kubernetes and containers. And I've been working with containers since probably around 2018, but almost entirely focused around security. So just looking forward to conversation today.
Awesome. And finally, Hasib, all the way from London.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Hasib Bodani. I am with a company called Rafe. I always wear the shirt, as Mike knows. Rafe is in the Kubernetes operations business. This topic today is about operations and management of Kubernetes. So, timely topic. Looking forward to sharing my thoughts on that subject with everybody.
All right, folks. Well, we're going to start with Hasib, and I guess some perspective here. I feel like, we've had a number of these panels over the years, and the conversation always started out with, well, someday Kubernetes is going to be a problem to manage, and we're going to finally get to these issues. And I kind of feel like we've finally got there. It's there. We're starting to see lots of Kubernetes. People have fleets of Kubernetes clusters. And I guess to see what is the issue that people run into, or when do they realize that they need to think about managing this differently? And, are we reaching the point where maybe we need something that feels like a Kubernetes anonymous 12-step program that recover from the way I manually do this to think about doing it in a different way? Where are we, Hasib, and how did we get here?
Yeah, I mean, KA sounds really interesting. I should have our marketing people think about it. Kubernetes Anonymous. Just in the last week, we had an announcement with a company named MoneyGram, who's been our customer for a while. They've been using our platform in the AWS for eGas operations for eGas for quite some time, and they're on their core applications on Kubernetes, and they have a fleet. They don't have 1 or 2 or 3 clusters. In fact, last week or 2 weeks ago now, we did a session with Techstrong with another company named MassMutual, who has, well, let's just say many clusters. You would be shocked, how many clusters they have, and they're in AWS as well for the most part. I mean, people have fleets, right? People have lots and lots of clusters, and in my experience so far, the first time people kind of say, "Oh, I need to step back and think about what it means to manage a fleet," 3 things happen in companies. One is, some teams come along and they say, "Well, I don't need a namespace. I need my own clusters." Okay, it's not a big deal, but then, how do you think about multi-tenancy? What does it mean to deliver an internal Kubernetes service across your company? So, because some people need a namespace, some people need a cluster, and what does that actually mean? What's multi-tenancy look like? So that's kind of problem number 1. Problem number 2 is more of a governance issue. I installed some security tooling on my cluster, Orca security maybe, I don't know. And a developer has cluster role binding and they delete the pods. What are you going to, or remove the pods? What are you going to do about it, right? How do you know? How do you know next day your clusters look the same? Governance around what I think my standard blueprint should be across in my company. Is it actually applied across the board, right? What is that reconciliation logic? What is that way to make sure? And the third one is, I don't know if somebody from Strong DM is on today. Oh, Josh is. Think about access, right? So I have all these different people in my company. They need different levels of access. What's the story? How do I make sure they have access to the right things? Can I audit this stuff? If I have 100 VPCs, 100 is actually not a big number for an enterprise. How many jump hosts do I need? That seems crazy. How's that going to work out? So these are 3 things that happen when people start thinking, I need to step back and think about my fleet and think about this holistically. There are other things that come about, policy management and whatnot, Mike. But so far, I see these 3 become that feather that breaks the camel's back, and then somebody says, guys, we got to stop.
All right. Jared, are you seeing the same thing? I mean, have we crossed the proverbial chasm, or is this one of those instances where, the future's here, but it's unevenly distributed, and some people have, 30 clusters and other people still have 1, and we're all over the place, and the journey is longer than that. So where are we, Jared? What do you think?
Well, management of clusters, just like management of people, becomes a problem as soon as you have more than 0. So definitely we have issues here, right?
Can you guys hear Jared, or is it just me?
Yeah, we can hear him.
Okay,
Gotcha.
Cool. I was just looking at the stats here on what Kubernetes recommends on the cluster sizes, and it's you don't look at them frequently. It's surprisingly small, right? It's 110 pods per node. That's not very many. A maximum of 5,000 nodes in a cluster. So any large scale enterprise can hit this quickly, and you're going to start scaling out multiple clusters.
All right. Now about that, and Jared brings up a great point, but it used to be people thought they were going to manage a few large clusters initially, and they were going to have these kind of Google web scale experiences. And now it seems like, what we have is this small army of small clusters. Is that the standard way that we're going to see all these clusters, or will they all get consolidated at some point and this will be a pendulum swing?
Yeah, I think I kind of agree with Hasib. It's like everybody wants their own clusters because namespacing doesn't necessarily do it for you. Because if you're going to mess with ingresses and have external networking routes, the developers are trying to develop something that utilizes the source of the network as part of their application. You have to have control over that. And if you have everything in the same cluster, you can create problems for your other applications. So then you're going to want more clusters. And I think that in order to get a grasp on security and auditing, to build these clusters, you codify everything. So that way you can audit the code and see if the code maintains proper governance and compliance. And that way, that is how you're able to reconcile everything with everything moving so quickly that at least what is deployed should match what you have in code, and then you can audit the code, and you could then follow the trail into what is actually deployed.
All right.
So I think yes, it's wider than it is taller.
All right.
Interesting. So I don't know. For some reason, my brain just went to like, oh, does that mean you're going to use cluster roll for everything? Or I know this is like probably a little deeper than, I see some, from my perspective, a lot of the issues that come up early on are inheritance related from like IAM roles, that kind of stuff. And it's easy to get wrong, right? Because there's, I don't know, 2,800, 3,000 different controls in IAM, right? On most of the public clouds. So I see that as a very early place where the complexity demon starts to come out,
Absolutely. But you can terraform your IAM roles as well, right? And you can have a combination of IAM roles and cluster roles, which are all, you're able to capture that in code. And yes, there are probably those edge cases that are out there.
Now, I can show you a demo that's going to blow your mind based on what you just said about Terraform and how you're going to completely get it wrong. Because the problem with reading code is that you got to read it every day. Are you going to read it 5 times a day or 10 times a day to make sure it's correct? That's the problem, right? So, and this is actually a real issue. And if you tie what you just said to what George just said, right? If every developer has cluster role binding, oh my God, I guarantee you have snowflakes in your fleet and you don't even know. I guarantee it, right? Which is why people then say, well, I'm not going to give people cluster role binding, but then they can't do the things they need to do, and then you have a bigger problem, right? So this is a really complex problem to solve, and just to kind of not to pick on Terraform or on Nung, kind of saying, well, it's IAC is not magic. A lot goes into it, and I've seen now enterprises try and build armies of engineers who kind of all they do is kind of put together automation, and then automation they write software to make sure the automation is good, and on that they do diffs, and oh my God, you're right. This is crazy, right? And sometimes all of us as an industry, the worst thing we do for our customers is that we trivialize it by saying automation, right, or infrastructure code, or Terraform, right? These are nice ideas, right? But just it's really hard for IT to do this stuff, right? Because this ties to Mike's point below. Is it equally distributed? You use better words than that. It's not. It's not equally distributed at all. Just today, I met a shop who's been doing this for multiple years, and they had very specific issues around IAC, actually, Josh, as it relates to IAM roles management, by the way. So their issue was, we run these pipelines and then we build these IAM roles, and then, people have very broad usage in Kubernetes, and then some people have too little. And how do I solve that problem? But in like an hour later, I met an insurance company who has exactly one cluster running in AWS right now, and they don't even know what they don't know, right? So this market is very, and to that team, if I said to them, hey, here's a Terraform provider, go figure it out, that's not gonna happen, right? So it's truly poorly distributed. I don't know how to solve that problem, Mike. And you were going to ask Roxana that question, perhaps? Maybe she
I am going to ask Roxana that because she has a background in DevOps, and I thought we solved all this stuff already. I mean, are we just reinventing the same wheels over again here, and we need a Kubernetes-specific flavor of DevOps, or is it just that maybe we weren't paying attention enough the first time? I have 4 children. They all went to school. If I'd known I'd been taking math over 4 times, I'd pay more attention the first time. So is that where we are?
So from my experience, and I talk a lot, I mostly talk to developers, even though I'm in the DevOps domain, and businesses with developers. I mean, they just want to write their code, and they just really don't care about if it's a single Kubernetes, if they have their own Kubernetes. But their tendency, as I saw it, is always to have something only for their own. So first they started deploying code on the same instance. They said, okay, let's make separate instances, separate EC2s. Then okay, let's make separate namespaces. And now it's the step when they say, well, I want my own Kubernetes cluster, and that's not a bad thing, because if something is very easy to manage, it is beginning to be easier to manage with cloud providers and solutions providing Kubernetes on demand, right? And because of that, developers say, well, I don't want to share anything with you. I just want my own solution. And they're at this point, they're searching for third parties services that provide Kubernetes as a service, or internally in large enterprises that they have dedicated teams which work to serve Kubernetes as a service to the other development teams. So they have the governance over the fleet of Kubernetes, because DevOps like to have control over it. But in the same time, they give developers the power to do that. Still, the issue remains with what you said about security. They can remove some of it, and maybe they have automatic tests on that. But in my opinion, I mean, if they would have, virtual cards, that they would create Amazon and Azure accounts on demand just to run a test and then delete it. I mean, maybe that's the next step.
Jacob, what do you make of all this? Because we talk about shifting left, and there's a difference between shifting left and kind of leaning left. But a lot of the shifting left with developers kind of feels, it sounds like, people are running around with scissors. It's not a good idea. So what is the right level of thought process here from a security perspective, at least, as you look at this whole management conversation?
Look, it's tough, and you have to decide how far left you're going to go, and the right answer for one company isn't going to be the right for another. For some companies, you're relatively small. You can go tear everything up, make it infrastructure as code, deploy everything. For other companies, you're multi-cloud, you're acquiring new companies from time to time. You have all of these new things coming in, and just getting your hands around what's out there can be really difficult. So you have to decide where you're going to approach it. If you can do things in a DevOps pipeline as infrastructure as code, definitely that's going to be an improvement. But you have to have tools too to get visibility for rogue IT or somebody who went around that to deploy their own clusters or to roll clusters onto bare EC2 instances that they've spun up. A lot of that sometimes becomes blind spot for security teams and for operations teams as well. And if you can't look out there and say how many pods are running, how many containers are out there, how many Kubernetes clusters you have, you're really going to struggle in general. So when it comes to shifting left, yes, do as much as you can, but make sure you have some kind of background tools, something else that can give you the visibility you need to detect everything out there. And once you have an idea of the problem space, then you can start approaching your shift left strategy, approaching your infrastructure as code with a lot of confidence as to what's actually out there. You can't rely 100% on shift left unless you have a high level of discipline that's really tough to get in a lot of organizations.
All right. Yeah. The question is, like, how many really full stack developers are there versus the rest of the population, right? Josh, what's your sense of this shift left conversation? I know, sometimes we were talking before the show about, being the grumpy guy, but what's your thought?
I think that I think that it is a very, very good instinct in companies, but I also see, at least in let's say you have a 20-person engineering org, to Jacob's point, that is, you're absolutely able to tear everything up and just push really, really far. But it's also really hard. I think a lot of times companies or organizations give up the ability to innovate on other things in their product when they're focused on trying to do the basics of trying to make their containers work in a secure way or in a way that delivers value. So, and in that way, I'm a fan of manage Kubernetes in some way, take that off of my plate. Yes, I will pay for it. I see that as a very healthy choice, even if it's not, this is all open source stuff. We should run it, right? Maybe not. So I don't know. Maybe that's the grumpy guy's answer to that. Maybe it's, I'm definitely not advocating for people to run monoliths, or to try to make that work, because you have some of the same problems there. They just manifest in a different way,
Jared, do you think some of this conversation is disingenuous? Because I'm asking the question because initially, if I look back in time, it was like full stack developers, a handful of them with those skills went out and said, we need to do cloud native and Kubernetes, and this is going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. Then they get to what Haseeb was talking about, 5 clusters or more, and they go running back to IT ops and say, please, can you take care of this stuff? Because, we can't be bothered and we got to go write some code. And now I almost feel like the IT ops people are now the ones driving this conversation to the rest of the developer community, because they're saying, hey, this stuff is great. We can scale up and down and we get more control and we can orchestrate all this stuff. But the rest of the developer community is not quite jumping as fast as everybody else is. So where are we on this continuum here? And who's driving the conversation these days for Kubernetes more? Is it ops or is it dev?
Well, as a grumpy old ops man, I think it's the ops team who's driving most of the stuff here. Devs are like, oh, I just want to deploy my code. And Kubernetes is kind of almost old hat, right? Like, they got their YAML all down. Everybody's using Helm. No one's really worried about how to deploy anymore. That seems like it's a more or less solved problem, hopefully. Now we're talking about how do we scale this thing. So the whole problem pushed back to ops, like you were saying. And it's like, now manage this beast we've created. And yeah, so I think the ops teams are looking for the better management tools, the better visualizations.
So what is that? Like, is it a platform like, like D2IQ? Is it a platform like, like Rancher? Is that, when you say that, what do you mean? I'm curious. Like, or
I don't really know what's the right answer here, but
Josh.
I think Haseeb has something to say about the wall of YAML files here.
You mentioned Rancher, Josh. It's a beautiful product. 100% of enterprises we speak with, 100% have tried it in some fashion. Maybe they use it purely for RBAC. RBAC is probably the most commonly used feature in my at least in my experience with Rancher. Followed very closely by the dashboard, right? So people like that a lot, and I use that thing because obviously work is strongly. But then, beyond those two features, there's a bunch of things customers need that, things like Rancher, platforms like Rancher don't do, right? And D2IQ doesn't even come close to Rancher. I think Rancher is phenomenal. Beyond what Rancher does, the backup and restore, the blueprinting, the access management, the policy management, the chargebacks, the drift detection, the GitOps for cluster management, the network policy management. I don't know, somebody wants it, Istio, so maybe there's service mesh kind of truly delivering that as an internal service, having dashboards at different levels. So you have ops engineers, and then you have the ops engineers who write the pipelines, and then you have developers who want to debug the code. How many dashboards do you have now? Count if you could, please. It's like 11, I think, right? So the challenge that mostly companies run into is that essentially what we're telling them is, look, and this is the other disingenuous thing that I want to sort of have a problem with. Here's a bunch of open source. It's all easy. Go put all together and good luck, right? Okay, now I got 11 dashboards. How many engineers do I need to figure all this stuff out? 22 maybe, right? I mean, at least one guy's 6, at least somebody else should know this stuff, right? Well, that's a lot of work, right? Everything starts with 2 people can do this, and everything ends with, oh my God, I can't even hire the people for the seats I have open in my company. That's just how it is in enterprises. It's because the talent isn't there. And more so, it's not so much about talent. It's just too much. In the last month-ish, I've talked about the following in a number of settings. The idea that VMware with vCenter did an incredible job building a platform that solves for VMs. But really, if you think about it, actually solves for VMs, but then it solves for access management because they have a way to do that. They solve for storage because you need storage, so they solve that problem. They solve for networking with NSX, right? They solve all these different problems because this is to run VMs at an enterprise level. You need all these problems solved so that you can be a VM admin, right? Just a VM admin, and you use vCenter. But in the Kubernetes world, what is the K-Center equivalent? What is a vCenter equivalent? Call it K-Center, which does all the things that Kubernetes needs to be done for an enterprise to consume all this stuff and then sell it internally as a product. I would posit. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say, are you going to say Tanzu next, or
so Tanzu? Oh my God, that's a. In a private setting, I'll say things, but in public settings, I will say, look, I mean, it doesn't do the things that were promised, right? Just Ask anybody. But the story, the premise of Tanzu is sound, right? They understand the problem. The delivery sometimes is behind in some companies. Now they're getting acquired by Broadcom. I don't know what's going to be left by the time that's done. But what Tanzu promised is sound, right? The question then becomes, who's actually going to deliver on that promise, right? So I don't know about Rancher. I mean, they haven't actually produced a whole lot of capabilities in the last couple of years. I think, a lot of the key people have left the company. There's not a whole lot of options out there and here's why there are not a whole lot of options. It's a really, really hard problem to solve. We're doing it. I'm telling you from experience, right? We have like 95 people writing code now, just writing code, right? We have a massive team, and it's a really, really hard problem. There's so many things that need to be done for each of just the differences in how EKS works versus AKS. Just that. Forget about everything else, right? Forget about all the things I talked about on top. Just EKS versus AKS. The way you upgrade them, they're entirely different. So then you have to have an organization just to do this, right? We have a team that does EKS, team that does AKS, team that does GKE, team that does upstream Kubernetes, and then you keep building this team. But the moat that I think the right company is going to solve this problem, of course, I would posit that we are one of those companies, maybe the only company at this time. The moat here is, man, it's a really, really hard problem to solve. We've solved 20, 30 different problems in our platform. And now for the next company to come about and solve all those 20, 30 problems, it took us 4.5 years to get here. 4.5 years. My God, that's a long time. Okay, that's what you got to do.
All right,
So
Roxana, you want to jump in here for a minute? I'm going to ask you this question with this context. A few years ago, I remember asking somebody, I said, what's the difference between you and a Google? And they said, well, Google has engineers and I have administrators. And that was basically their fundamentals. So, are we going to get to a point where Kubernetes is accessible enough to be managed by mere mortal IT administrators versus requiring engineers to do almost everything these days? Where are we on that curve?
Well, now since we do have offerings from cloud and from other companies that do offer the Kubernetes already installed and set up, they're highly available and secured and all that DevOps things that we do care about, but developers don't. Developers don't only have to focus on learning to use Kubernetes. And I feel, and it's also related to the question before, where the ops is kind of controlling the Kubernetes, but I feel that in developers, it's kind of a DevOps and there's a lot of knowledge that DevOps have that is pushed to developers. It's not just algorithmic, it's not just coding and being innovative in code. They have to write code that can run and can benefit from Kubernetes, what Kubernetes offers. You need to learn Kubernetes. You need to set the microservices correctly, the coupling of the services correctly. So I guess that for the management of Kubernetes, there is already a step that is in process where developers and some medium businesses where they don't need fleets maybe, or they don't want to be bothered with managing their own Kubernetes cluster, they can skip this step. But the other step with the Kubernetes and the know-how and the knowledge, they can't do that, because with Kubernetes, it is a pretty deep learning curve. I mean, it's not something that you read the documentation and you start using it from the next day. And it's not as easy. I mean, first it seems flexible and intuitive, but then when you architect your application and structure, you start realizing, well, this is not going to work. Some of this will scale differently from this. It will fail in the middle of something. How do I manage that? So I feel that now developers don't, and you can see that in interviews. If you apply for an engineering as a developer, even as a backend, you're receiving DevOps questions, and also Kubernetes questions, which maybe it's something shared between DevOps and devs.
All right, I agree with that. But Jacob, the questions that aren't in that thing that don't get shared are the security ones. So how do we kind of get this security conversation going where the so-called DevSecOps team is now pushing the security out to the developers as well? Is that what needs to happen, and can it happen?
Yeah, it definitely can happen. I mean, we write automation tests for all sorts of things, full stack tests, unit tests, all of these things. Put a security scan of the containers that you're building to roll out, do vulnerability and malware scan and all these other things to make sure you're building compliant things that are going to be rolled out. That's how you do it at the container level, but then you have to take it a step out. You have to do that at the Helm chart level or at the YAML file level and make sure those are being built in a secure way. And you have to roll that all up to one tool. And that's all hoping that everything gets funneled through your pipeline the way it should be and that nothing else malicious is out there at all. Then you have to go ahead and do kind of what Josh said and maybe throw in the towel a little bit and say, we're going to use a managed Kubernetes cluster. We're going to use EKS, AKS, GKE, whatever it is. And you probably should, because you have to actually manage that and keep that compliant and secure as well. And after it's all out there and running, you have to figure out how you're going to monitor what's actually running, what's actually being produced in that cluster, the outputs, the logs, all these things. It's a really tough, a tough problem to have. And on top of that, a lot of the more legacy solutions have you deploy an agent to do that. So it's one more thing that someone has to own and maintain and update and monitor and make sure it's running and collect all of that. So what we do here is more of an agentless approach where you can just onboard your cloud provider and anything that's out there, you get that visibility for it. It's just trying to take things off of the plate of the ops team and the development team to let the security team work more around security and not about being an agent plumber, getting something deployed out there and running and all of this. It's just making it as easy as you possibly can. And that's what you need, because Kubernetes in itself is hard. It's hard enough before you start trying to answer, well, what happened at this date, at this time, in this pod, on this container? That's a really, really hard question to answer. So you have to just make sure you're thinking about it from the beginning to do as much as you can. But once it's out in production, make sure you're still monitoring it there too.
Jared, I would posit that, 80% of all Kubernetes clusters out there are misconfigured. So do we need to go back and kind of go in and look at this whole thing and say, we have this ticking time bomb on the other side of this thing where we really haven't thought through the management of this, and maybe we need to go back and look at everything we already done, never mind what we're about to do?
That's a terrifying question. I would say if you guys are, you're a small startup and you've been doing infrastructure code since day one, and you have a full history of your deployment, and you know exactly what it looks like, and you've everything been under control since the start of time, you're probably okay. But if you're like any real company, you've had some horrible choices being made, and you had some people with elevated privileges who just went and hand bombed things. Oh, I'll back that up there later, no problem. Yeah, it never happens. I mean, I've seen a lot of, I've done a lot of bad stuff. So, I would be surprised if we didn't really need to go back and really just look back at your clusters. A good exercise one day for a team would be to recreate production. Get production on the new cluster and see if your infrastructure actually works, your deployments actually can move on there, and what hand bomb time bombs you leave out there.
All right. Hey, Nung.
I was going to say one way to mitigate those things too, and if you can't, if you don't want to rely on code scanning roles and things, is having governance software in your cluster that looks for those holes and that comes back and reminds you, hey, this role still has this permission. Or you can even have tools in place that just don't even allow that permission to happen. And I guess you have to kind of strike at the security and governance problem from, I guess, both ends. That way you're doing the best you can to ensure that you don't have any of those gaps in your security or in your permissions model, and also being compliant to something that is your known state.
Sometimes those governance tools, though, or the compliance tools, like, they can be easily overwhelming, right? Like, if you release that in your cloud infrastructure, it's like, oh my God, you come back, it's a screen full of red, and you're like, never mind, this is going to get a new job. This is too much.
Is that
but
the equivalent of turning off SC Linux when you need to actually do anything useful?
Exactly. Oh, this looked hard. Never mind.
But instead of having one of those tools, though, that looks like, say, your entire cloud account that just shows you hundreds of pages of reports, right? Having one, I guess, that's focused on your cluster may be a little easier to consume, in the smaller chunks. And
and just making sure that's a tool you have or a view you have is important, but you also need to think about, how do I even know that a new cluster has been created? How do I even know that something's even been deployed out there? Because a lot of people have overprivileged permissions, and maybe they go to a conference and say, oh, EKS sounds like the greatest thing ever, and they go and spin one up the next week, and maybe they never touch it again. Or maybe even worse, they deploy something that's running some critical workload in it, and you never even knew about it. You have a couple hundred cloud accounts or even a couple dozen, whatever. Monitoring all of them in all of the regions is really hard. So you at least have to have something that gives you the visibility to know that something's out there to then go and protect it. And that's hard from a cluster level. It's hard from a container level. It's hard from a VM level. In the cloud, it's a really hard problem that just doesn't spin the same way it did in the data center, where you filled out a form saying, hey, please provision this VM and waited 2 weeks for somebody to come back. So keeping up with that can be really difficult.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I would add,
you definitely rely on your account permissions.
Yes.
Yeah. And I would add to that like you Jacob, you didn't totally miss it, but think about the number of credentials that you're generating to do that.
100%.
And that is the stuff that is going to get found and used against you if you're not really methodical about how you're maintaining those creds and giving people access to them.
Exactly.
All right. Hey, Roxanna, we got a question from the audience that I want to throw your way because it's a little bit, kind of obvious, but so why don't we have standard design patterns that people are just using to deploy stuff, and we're not creating this kind of misconfiguration nightmare that we're talking about, because there is a defined path there. Is that too hard to do in Kubernetes, or we're just not mature enough to do it?
Well, actually, I think one of the benefits that the biggest benefit that I think Kubernetes brought is kind of some standardization in how DevOps works. So, because there were hundreds and thousands of ways to do a single deployment and a single rollout or a single AJ architecture or deployment. And I think Kubernetes did help in that. And it's very good that you can start with some standardization that will give you auto scaling, instantly. It will give you high availability instantly, but just by the way it's designed. And of course, it's good to have such a design pattern in your flow, but of course you need to go, depending on some cases, you need the flexibility to implement what works for your application. And that's where Kubernetes still excels, because it is configurable to the core, in which you can create a flow that suits you properly. And just one thing that I really wanted to add, because someone said about security before, about it would be very good if when you install a Kubernetes cloud in the cluster, they would have a dashboard or something to notify you have any open ports and you have any security issues. And I think this is what they did with Mongo, because Mongo, when you installed it, it had no authentication enforced. So I think it was 80% of the deployments of Mongo deployments you could authenticate with it. There was no authenticator you could access. And I think AWS solved some of this issue, because they were sending you mail saying, please, can you put a password here? Maybe they're going to do that for Kubernetes as well.
All right, well, that's a good question. Haseeb, why don't we see more of that level of automation and guardrails and things that would prevent people from making these mistakes? And we have all this stuff out here. I feel like we have the technology. We just haven't kind of put it in some way that is consumable. Or is it just that everybody wants to play with an API and devil be damned?
We have a feature in a product called, we call it Blueprints. It's a blueprint. And it's easily the most used kind of operational feature on a platform, because the point of it is to create a blueprint, so that the center of excellence team inside the company can make a determination that all of our clusters are going to have this kind of policy on it. We're going to back them all up, and I want Orca and this and this and this and this on it, and but this version of Prometheus, but not that version of Prometheus, and these are the roles I'm going to have, etc. So you can create this whole policy, and then you can, when a new cluster comes up, you just inherits it, so that you can actually go into this self-service model where a developer. So we support this provisioning methodology via GitOps, where you can have a spec file. It's very simple to read. You can have it in a Git repo. and a developer can just write it and they can try and check it in. And so long as, let's say, Roxana approves the PR, their infrastructure will be created, not just clusters, but everything else around it. And it's going to have the blueprint on it, and it's going to have the role bindings on it. And if you choose to, we support this concept called cluster labels, so you can actually deploy applications as well on those clusters. So this feature we built because there was a gap. Right, so one of the things we've done is, look, we consume a lot of stuff from the community. There are things we consume, and then there are things we build. We built some really cool things around this concept called blueprinting. We built a lot of cool stuff around access management. We built a lot of cool things around multi-tenancy. And the intent is that we're going to actually open source them all. So, we're going to kind of one by one kind of give back. We're going to keep running our service, but then some customers, may never want to use our service, and that's okay. We have these capabilities. But this blueprint concept that we built is really elegant. And in the larger enterprises who are our customers, and the logos on our website of these large companies, majority of them end up standardizing their Kubernetes operations around this one capability called blueprinting. But this, in my opinion, is only interesting if you think beyond a cluster. If you think in terms of one cluster, nobody cares. But if you have many of them, then this is a gap. And of course, because you and I have been talking for 4 years about this before we had a product to sell, right? I mean, what I've been preaching is nobody's going to have a single cluster. And for some years ago, people used to say that's just a crazy talk, right? I mean, people will have 3 clusters and that's it. It hasn't worked out that way, right? People have many. And because we made a bet that people will have many, we built capabilities with the assumption that people will have many and they will have multiple teams. So yeah, we sell this, and my goal is that we're going to contribute this back to the community at some point in the near future. So.
Hey, Nung, let me ask you something. When do people cry uncle and go to a managed service provider like you, and at some point they go, this is just more trouble than it's worth, and let's find somebody else to do that? So where is that uncle point?
I'm not really sure, because I think some people just give up and they go back to running things on, containers and ECS or Elastic Beanstalk or the likes in the other clouds, where they just, they're happy with just something that just runs their container and then managing their load balancers and doing it all that way versus spinning up clusters. I think some of them will maybe come back and say, okay, we have a better approach to this. Let's find somebody to help us, be successful in Kubernetes, because their architecture teams, and they sit back and go, this is something that we find would really help if we can make that shift to Kubernetes with our infrastructure and prove it out in a cluster, because we need to be able to build environments, at whim or deploy them in multiple regions consistently. And, everybody comes back going, well, I think Kubernetes is the way we should do this, but we need to get better at it. And in addition to sending people out to training, you also have consulting services come in and just build clusters for you that you can build while you're still running your production and your development environments, and then slowly move people over and slowly build up that skill level within your team. And your team also feels like, okay, the company recognizes what the future is, and they're investing in their people and getting training and also giving you the opportunity to build those new things in those in the cloud, and bring the entire tech competency of the personnel staff up. So having somebody to be there to show you how it's done and do it in context with what you're doing, instead of just some random template, and then being able to run tests. I think that becomes the way to do it.
Hey, Mike,
Speaking of random templates, wait, hold on, just want to follow up on that one thought. Speaking of random templates, Jared, you just posted here on the side that there's a difference between a best practice, which you don't want to call things, and what we've been talking here in terms of a deployment methodology. What is that, or a design pattern? What is that subtle difference in your mind?
So this is something I've been kind of banging around for a while, but like a best practice, like people are like, oh, I want the best practice. Like how should I do my deployment? Well, that's somebody else's layout roadmap. It's not necessarily make sense for you. You're going to tweak that best practice. All these companies, they all have these huge guides on how to do best practices. Really what you want to look for, like standards of what makes sense. So like if you do deployment, the best practice is for it to have be highly available. Well, that's a standard. So maybe on your side, highly available is really good failover from one pod, just as a kind of brain dead example here. You have one pod, but the next one comes up real fast. And that's your HA. It's cool. But it doesn't have to be 6 wide with a load balancer in front of it. That might be the best practice of the document, though. That's kind of what I'm thinking here. It's like, standard is HA, and the best practice is how you do it inside.
All right. Haseeb, you agree with that? Does that make sense?
So I can still not hear Jared.
Well, Jared was essentially saying that design is tailored to the individual specifics of a company and not, some generic thing that everybody uses.
He's right. Look, as one example, we create these concepts called base blueprints with the assumption that everybody's going to change it all, right? So if you have no opinions, we have something that you can get going with. But very quickly, you're going to have your own opinions. And that's okay, so long as there's a way to bring them all together in a repeatable fashion, right? But every enterprise builds their own, and that's the point of any blueprint that any company were to implement or anybody were to implement, right? That's the right way to do it, right? They have their own blueprints, and we're going to help them stitch them together. Mike, you said something before that I want to kind of ask about. You said the phrase managed service for Kubernetes. When you said managed service, did you mean EKS or AKS, or did you mean a company running the Kubernetes for you?
I was kind of leaning towards the latter because that term managed service gets tossed around a lot. But, one is as a service versus a managed service, which, but the industry has yet to kind of really make that distinction as clear to people as I would prefer. But that's a fight for another day. Josh, you were talking about edge computing. And of course, everybody says, which flavor of edge are we really talking about? But if we start pushing all this stuff out to something that we're calling the edge, is this whole situation going to get worse before it gets better?
Yes. I mean, look, this is the classic span of control issue, and at least from like coming from a military background, when you got orders or like you got some sort of, command decided, hey, here's the objective. They would tell you, this is what I want as an end state. This is the objective I want to get to. And then they leave it to you in large part to figure out how you're going to do it, within, legal, moral, and ethical kind of constraints. And I think that the solution for edge computing needs to be something around that, whether it's governance as code. So, that kind of, or compliance as code. Those are the things that I think are going to help, as long as it's not written too tightly. Like there has to be some, play at the edges, so to speak. Even though I think that's probably going to introduce more edge cases for failure states. So I don't know yeah.
I get a little wiggy about those military metaphors because then I'm always like, so how many casualties can I accept before I have to retreat? I mean, where are we?
Aren't we supposed to be treating this infrastructure like cattle anyway?
I don't know. I do know one thing. If you go down to Texas and start killing people's cattle, they'll get really pissed off at you. So I don't like that metaphor.
You just shot Betsy.
All right, guys, as we think about where we are at the moment, is there something, and I'm going to go around here, everybody pick one thing maybe, or you can agree with the next person. Well, let's start with Roxana. What is the one thing you wish people would fix in Kubernetes that would make it easier to manage? Do you have like this thing that you wake up in the middle of the night going, how come we're still dealing with this? This is crazy.
Yeah. So I would address the observability. Really, this is the system that you always have to set up for the applications, like all the time. I would like to see something that is in Kubernetes related to observability of the application running in Kubernetes, and Kubernetes to treat it as a resource, like it treats all the workloads. It's like a separate thing. We have the deployments, we have the workloads, and we manage them. But if you want centralized logging and everything, you have to manage that alone, again, by the DevOps. So I would like a more integrated.
Yeah. We don't want to keep buying additional tools that should be features. Is that where we're going? All right, Nung, what do you think?
Yeah, when she said that, I was like, that's exactly what observability monitoring. Make it easier. I know there's Prometheus, but man, I still don't know PromQL very well. Um, I also want to be able to point to something to like a developer I'm just introducing to Kubernetes, and it's like they know top or HTOP. It's like, isn't there a KTOP or something? Maybe get BTS in here and bring some K-pop in. But to just be able to type something from the command line that you're connected to your cluster, and you get memory and CPU usage, something that they can relate to, it opens up, because a lot of developers feel that Kubernetes becomes this black box, and then they hate you for it, because it's like they want to see how things run. And it's like, well, I guess you can still get your logs, but performance stuff that right out of the box, because it's in there, and they recognize it's in there because you've got Prometheus and Grafana already built in. But you now have to, if you're not familiar with those tools, you now have to go out and get a base primer on it, and hopefully you can then you're now given tools to kind of figure out what it is. You'll figure out what it is that's important to you. What are you looking at? But if that were built in, we can present a few things right off the bat, and then that becomes that launch pad for exploring your performance.
All right, Josh, what do you got on your mind?
I mean, I feel like the OSI layer 8 is often the hard part of running any of this. So like I would say that, like, I would try to make sort of the IAM role side of the house, the authorization, the authentication, somewhere on that spectrum. I would try to get that more native in the platform, because I see a lot of different approaches to it, and I see it break with, like, look, I was helping one particular customer last week that had a stray tab in their config map, and the linting hadn't picked it up when he was looking at it in his just trying to hand inspect it. That's the kind of thing that humans are not very good at finding those kind of things, or at least sometimes it doesn't stand out that way. So I think infrastructure, like actual how it touches human beings, is like from the development side, your technical staff, how they are interacting with it. That's what I would do. Because I think all the, like, I agree with the observability thing. I was going to say networking or DNS, but I think we have some good answers to that already. But I'm curious if anybody else will bite on DNS or networking.
Jared, what do you think? You on board with that, or you got something else?
Well, Josh and I are like best friends now, because DNS and networking are like my favorite topics. We should do a tech days on that. But anyway, like, actually one thing I really like to see people do, and it's kind of off topic for here, but I would love to see the network security be more common in these deployments. I see lots of deployments out there with no firewall policies in your Kubernetes, right? So every pod and every namespace can talk to everybody else on all their ports, and no one's checking, right? And that kind of plays in the observability market, I suppose. Well, who's talking to who? And you look at all the examples online, no one ever does network security.
All right, well, that leads us to Jacob. I mean, Jacob, I'm surprised we have yet another platform where security seems to be an afterthought, but
Yeah. And to me, Kubernetes is great at running containers, but it'll run pretty much whatever you tell it to run. So you got to build your admission controllers. You got to maybe use OPA, whatever it is you want to do to make sure the right things are running in your cluster. But from like a container and Kubernetes ecosystem perspective, container registries that actually kind of age out old images, so you can't just grab an ancient thing and run it that's full of vulnerabilities and everything else. There's no good solution around scanning vulnerabilities and actually removing and doing basically the long-term maintenance of running a containerized environment. There's no really great way to do that. There's a lot of tools to support it, but nothing's really built in around image trust and image provenance and things like that to make sure you're actually running what you expect to be running, and to make sure you're running up-to-date versions and you're aging old things out that are vulnerable and known to be vulnerable. So just improvements around security in general in the platform itself. That's of course. That's what I would say.
All right. Hasib, you were king for a day of Kubernetes. What is it that you want to fix?
Oh my God, it's a long list. There's no standard ingress controller, CNI. There's still a fight going on about which one's going to win. I don't know. We'll see. People talk about chaining CNIs, but then Cilium does something special. I mean, these are all kind of things that become pains for people like us, right? We're trying to help people kind of make decisions sometimes. It would be really nice for the community to say, you know what, here's what we like. Everybody uses Nginx, just make it a standard. And then somebody on the Q&A, they asked about add-ons, right? So this is something actually that's probably more close to my heart than anything else. This idea that there's now a concept called an add-on in Kubernetes. It's really good because, look, people treat add-ons and then applications as two different things. They're very actually different. Their life cycles are different. But for the longest time, we've kind of treated them all as a deployment or whatever, right? Or whatever this thing. And actually, that's not really how things work in an enterprise, right? The life cycles are different. Who runs them are different. Who owns them are different. So I'm actually really happy that there's recognition that an add-on like a Prisma Compute is a thing, right? Which is different from the application layer, right? That's a really, really good thing. And over time, kind of having different life cycles for apps versus add-ons, I think is the right answer. And if we continue this path forward, I think the one thing that's going to happen is the community will recognize how actually our customers use these platforms. There's an ops team that only cares about add-ons, and they don't care about the app. And there's an app team that doesn't actually care about Kubernetes at all, frankly. I don't think most developers actually want to learn this stuff, right? I mean, they're too busy. And this is a good step in the right direction to create this abstraction is the wrong word, but this layer so that we can have different people in the company own different things in the cluster. And I think this is a really, really good step. So I'm happy about this.
All right. Well, Roxana, you want to follow up on that a little bit with your DevOps expertise? Because I would observe one thing. It's like, so we're complaining about Kubernetes and what to manage that. But to Hasib's point, we now have all these extensions, and then we have all these other things that we're supposed to deploy on top of it, whether it's Prometheus and all this. So is the environment itself getting harder to manage than the actual clusters? And this whole thing is just going to be even more challenging as we go along.
Well, this was the tools that were provisioned in the first place, even before Kubernetes. I mean, it's still, we're just dragging them along. I mean, the security tools, the scanning tools, the monitoring tools, the logging tools. I don't think it's become, it's harder now. I just don't think it's easier. It's easier from some, I mean, before when you worked with VMs, doing something highly available, zero downtime, man, it was hard to do it. I mean, they were speeding up so slowly. Now, some of the issues are easier. But the part with the tools that you still need, I don't think it's because it became easier. I think there are emerging tools that are focused on solving some of them. But again, they still need to be solved.
All right. Well, hey, Josh, you brought this up, so I'm going to throw it your way because it is a pet peeve of mine, but we only got 2 minutes. But this word day two, I mean, like, it's a problem from day one. It's not like I got up on the second day and said, oh, my God, I got a whole set of new problems. So I always never been a big fan of this whole day two conversation. But, is there a separation in your mind about day one versus day two? Or, most IT people I know are like, I had a problem yesterday and I got a problem today.
I think you're right on there. But look, infrastructure as code is fantastic at doing the day zero or day one stuff, right? And oftentimes you don't even really know what you're going to end up needing. Like they say no plan, survives first contact with the customer or the enemy, right? So like that's it's all you're gonna say, oh man, we really need to do that other thing. So like even having the perfect plan going into it, you're gonna have to add something. Or maybe there's a CVE out, for jQuery or whatever, and you've got to replace a piece of it. That's to me, that's one of the really attractive things is that in these in these containerized environments, you can kind of white label things. So like I don't like that specific observability tool. Great, I'll bring in this other one. That's also complexity, but that's all day two stuff, right?
All right, guys, believe it or not, an hour has flown by, and we are just getting started, so you can imagine how the people who are watching this feel. But I want to thank you all for sharing your knowledge and expertise today. This was awesome as always, guys, and be safe. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Cody to take us out.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks.
And thank you to our entire panel for being here today. I'd like to remind our audience that this session was recorded. So following this panel, you should be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also find the recording living on the Container Journal website at containerjournal.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. So we do still have those 4 gift cards to give away. Our first winner is Philip T. Our second winner is Pinku N. Our third winner is Anirban B. And our fourth and final winner is Cyprian U. So to the 4 of you, congratulations. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. But if you don't happen to see that email, please check your spam folder. So to our panel, thank you so much for being here. And to our audience, we really appreciate you spending the past hour with us. We ask for 1 extra moment of your time to fill out a brief post-webinar survey that should pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But otherwise, we do hope to see you at an upcoming Techstrong Learning workshop or webinar. Everyone have a great rest of your day.
See you guys.
All right, thank you.